weeks ago, new funding for paying poll workers more, funding to make it easier to mail in your ballots, make it easier to get an absentee ballot, actually making Election Day a holiday. That's a very obvious and logical step we ought to take in North Carolina. There are lots of ways we could boost turnout at a very reasonable cost. It ought to be a public holiday. As to, so much remains up in the air as to how it's going to go in November, of course, because we don't know what the state of the pandemic will be at that time. But it's clear that it is the prudent thing to do to prepare as if it's going to continue to be a big problem. I know there's been questions raised about the whole issue of mail-in voting because of what happened in the 9th District here in North Carolina. We've kind of been the national poster child for corruption in mail-in ballots. Rick Hazen, who's a professor at the University of California, Irvine, is one of the nation's leading experts on voting rights, wrote a good piece the other day in the Washington Post in which he cited that, noted that's something we've got to be prepared for. But now that we know to be on the lookout for ballot harvesting, there are ways to prevent it. There are ways to enforce the law against illegal doctoring of ballots. And there are steps we can take that are reasonable, that have worked in other states. There's no reason we can't still have a very high voter turnout in November if we just, approach it from a rational point of view. As to what the General Assembly is going to do, and I know my time is limited here, I don't want to go on too much longer. It's a little hard to say. Again, the Board of Elections, you can check it out on our website or at WRAL or at the State Board of Elections. They've come up with a reasonable list of recommendations. It's gotten kind of a mixed reaction from the legislative leadership. We know that the legislature is coming back into session April 28th. Their plans are still a little vague as to how they're going to actually have session. What we believe is going to happen is that the public is not going to be admitted to the legislative building. They will only be able to watch virtually. The legislators will probably make use of the galleries in the House and the Senate as a means of having distance between the actual lawmakers. They may admit credentialed media to the building. We'll see about that. Certainly hope so. We've had a lot of meetings of the House of Representative committees coming up with recommendations. There does seem to be a good deal of bipartisan work there, which is encouraging. The Senate, however, has been notably silent. It's been crickets chirping over in Phil Berger's office. And that's always a bit of a concern. They don't have a very strong record of taking public input in a positive way. They tend to go their own way. It's something we're going to be watching very closely. There were a series of 5 recommendations that the Budget and Tax Center put out this weekend as to how they ought to approach the legislative session. I'd urge you to check those out on our website. The basic gist is lawmakers need to make full use of the federal aid that's coming down. They should not cut taxes. That's the last thing we need to do. There are ways to provide direct support to taxpayers and small business, but a broad-based tax cut is the last thing we need when we're going to be facing huge deficits come the new year. We need to use the state reserves to meet immediate needs of the most vulnerable people. We need to preserve public services like healthcare, public safety, and we need to make sure that if we do need to pay new taxes, if we do need to put new levies on individuals and corporations, that they should focus on the people who benefited the most over the last decade from the Republican tax cuts that have been implemented. That is essentially the wealthy, the well-off, and large corporations. So that's something to be watching. My bottom line message: the legislature is going to be something we all need to get online and watch very, very closely in the coming weeks. It's not a body that has a strong record of responding to public input or bowing to public pressure, and it's something we're going to have to be watching very closely. I hope that's a decent summary of where we stand. Becca, I'd be happy to take any questions that folks might have.
Susan, could you give me my video back?
Rob, Patience is going to be reading the chat and throwing you some questions.
Okay.
Yeah,
There are many, many.
Sure.
Okay, just a second. Yeah, we're going to start with prisons. Amy says, I listened to Chesa Bodine on Fresh Air last week. They were able to reduce the San Francisco prison population by 40% in a short period of time to accommodate social distancing with strategic application of potential release data. Is North Carolina attempting a similar effort?
Not yet. There are efforts to make demands upon them to do that. There is a lawsuit that's pending. There are, I believe I saw an amicus brief that was coming out from our parent organization and a variety of civil rights groups this afternoon to be filed. I think those are the kinds of demands that are being made. But to my knowledge, North Carolina Department of Correction is not moving with that kind of speed that we probably wish they would.
Okay, and a couple folks had questions about Governor Cooper's recent order with regard to prisons. Is it enough? What more needs to be done in addition to what?
Well, I think by identifying what you said the folks are doing in California,
yeah.
You probably could get an indication that a lot more could be done. We're not there, they're not that moving that quickly in that direction. I think his orders have been fine. Sort of a minimalist approach. We're going to be very careful. We're going to clean everything. We're going to limit who can come into the facilities. But we know that the virus is already there. We know that people are at risk. And I think there remains a grave concern that we haven't done enough and we need to do a lot.
Marilyn wants to know, how do we protect families when an exposed inmate comes home?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, they're going to have to come up with a quarantine procedure themselves. Obviously, you can't release someone without ideally without some sort of directives and counseling and families. By and large, what I'm seeing from the families, dozens of families who are commenting on our websites, I guess it's safe to say that they're willing to take the risk. I mean, they're willing to have their family member come home. They think they're in a better position to do well at home. But obviously, we've got some real challenges in that regard. That's happening in lots of situations in the society right now where people have maybe gone home to be with relatives and they have to grapple with how they're going to maybe isolate or quarantine for the first 2 weeks that they're there. It's going to be imperfect, obviously. What's
the most effective thing we can do to help the situation at the prisons, we as citizens? What are the inflection points and who's in control of it?
Well, I think it's both the governor and the legislature, but I think the governor probably is the person to focus on, the Department of Correction, I should say Department of Public Safety. Those are the kind of folks who need to hear from us. I think you need to speak up on social media, speak up on your Facebook pages, letters to the editor, highlighting some of these success stories that have happened in other states. My sense is that the Cooper administration wants to do the right thing. They probably haven't made this their top priority. And again, I think this goes back to the sort of political reality of who's the most influential constituency. And I think I don't know this, but I would guess it's true. It seems to make intuitive sense that if you're a Democratic governor who is likely to be at odds with a very conservative General Assembly, and you're in an election year, and the last thing you want is a story where you've released prisoners and they go out and commit some horrible crime. I mean, that's just the hard reality of the politics of a situation like this. I think Cooper's heart is in the right place. I wonder, what about the politics a little bit. And I think to the extent he gets boosted and there's pressure coming, average citizens speaking up and saying, this is a unprecedented crisis. It requires unprecedented action. It's probably beneficial.
Okay, and turning now to elections, Marilyn has a question.
Sure.
Can you comment on how HAVA provided emergency funding to North Carolina for elections? In a North Carolina House COVID-19 subcommittee meeting last week, there was a mention of North Carolina matching funds required. Is that also your understanding? And if so, should we press our legislators across North Carolina to approve those funds?
I believe that's right, but I must confess to you, that sounds right to me. I would have to double check. I think that makes, I can't imagine there won't be a need for significant action by state lawmakers to appropriate state funds. We've heard nothing from the folks on the right, but what a great surplus North Carolina has and how much money we've saved because, and I would argue, in fact, that we could have just as nice of a surplus and have a lot more robust public services if we had left taxes where they were in 2013 instead of slashing them. But setting that aside, there is money in the budget to do a lot of good things. It seems almost a certainty that we're going to need to be spending money both to match federal funding and just to improve our system as it stands on our own. So I think that's definitely something we should let lawmakers know, that it's critical that we have a fair election that is open to as many people as possible this November. Our democracy depends on it. We want to have a huge voter turnout. Whatever they can do to, as I said, the State Board of Elections has made several recommendations of additional funding needs. For instance, just paying our poll workers more so that we can actually attract some, more people. also the whole idea of making election day a holiday so that we're not limited just to people who are retired to work at our polling places would be a great idea as well. There's also money that's needed to make it easier for people to mail in their ballots and not have to put postage on the darn thing. So there's all kinds of steps like that that are going to require state funding. I must confess, I don't know the specific answer on the match question, but it sounds logical and probably right.
Okay, some folks have questions about vote by mail. We do have no excuse absentee ballots in North Carolina. Why isn't that enough?
Well, I mean, I think that's basically what we're talking about here. We need to facilitate it. We need to encourage it. We need to make it much easier. We need to, there's things that you can also do, for instance, with vote by mail that have been done in other states. For instance, giving people the chance to correct an error. So let's say you mail in your ballot and an error is determined, rather than just throwing your ballot away, maybe there's a system in place, as they have in other states, to correct your errors, to be in contact with. There are steps that we can take to make our no excuse absentee balloting a lot easier, making it easier to ask for a ballot, making it easier to mail your ballot in, perhaps addressing the issue of whether you need to have 2 signatures on the ballot. There are all kinds of steps that could be taken that have been effectively implemented in a wide variety, mostly Western states, that seem to be working just fine and have actually boosted turnout. So again, it's probably just a matter of improving a system rather than reinventing the wheel.
What's the best way for us to advocate for mail-in ballots? And is there a chance that the Republican legislature will make changes to make it easier to vote by mail?
I think it's likely they will make. We've already gotten some indication that they're amenable to some. It doesn't, there is this problem for the Republicans that their president, the man who himself votes by mail, has been ranting about it and saying it's bad for Republicans. The Democrats are going to rig the elections, and I think it puts them in a little bit of a difficult political situation, even though there are plenty of Republican governors and legislatures around the country that have fully embraced voting by mail. So I think it's, letting our lawmakers know this is important. We're very serious about this. We want to have as broad of a vote by mail option as possible. We want to make it as easy for people as possible. We want to make it easy for people. It's also important to keep in mind that there are people for whom voting by mail is not going to work very well. There are people who have physical disabilities or maybe are in a facility where they can't easily do that. There are people with reading disabilities. They're going to need to be accommodations for people for whom vote by mail isn't going to work. But again, letting your lawmakers know we support this idea, it's working in other states. If other states can make it the sole way they conduct an election, surely North Carolina can make it a bigger part of our voting than just, whatever it is, 10% right now.
There's some confusion about terminology and folks want clarification. What is the difference between vote by mail and absentee vote?
I don't think there is a difference. Okay. I think it's essentially, it's a different way to say the same thing.
Okay. How many prisoners, no, excuse me, I'm sorry. If a prisoner incarcerated for a petty crime dies in prison from COVID-19, is this grounds for a murder lawsuit against the state? I mean, are there legal ramifications of not releasing people?
Well, I doubt that there would be a murder situation, but I do think there is litigation ongoing. It's hard for me to imagine that that's a winning lawsuit, but it's possible. I suppose there is somebody who might be out there wanting to bring some sort of a lawsuit seeking compensation for wrongful death or for injury to someone, if it could be shown that the state was malicious or negligent in its actions. Those are tough. Prisoner lawsuits are tough to win, but this is an extraordinary situation, and so I think advocates for incarcerated people are looking at all possibilities.
As a key battleground state, is it advantageous for us to raise our national profile by appealing to national media outlets if the North Carolina General Assembly isn't amenable to making absentee balloting easier?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think I can't see a downside to that. I think that there is, this is an extraordinary year. I think North Carolina is widely recognized as a battleground state. We have to say that we have a mixed reputation at the national level over the last few years would be an understatement. I think there is a predilection even on the part of the national media to be skeptical about what the North Carolina General Assembly is doing. And, it's no guarantee that you're going to pressure them into doing the right thing, but I think it's something that is likely to, we got to use whatever tools are at our disposal. The reality is that we still have despite all that's gone on, despite the 2018 election, despite the perceived change in the public mood in this country, we still have a legislature that is largely unrepentant about what they've done. They are still trying to figure out ways to secure Republican majorities in the legislature in 2021. They're going to be doing just about everything they can think of to hold on to the power they've got. So we've got to use whatever means we can to force them to make the ballot as widely accessible as possible. So yes, I think bringing the national media into it if we can is worth a shot.
A couple of folks have pointed out that with absentee voting under our current system, you have to send a ballot request in ahead of time.
Right.
And they're wondering if vote by mail would just automatically send ballots to everyone who's registered.
That's one suggestion that has been done. That's done in other states. Either send a form that to everybody saying just check the box here and you automatically get it, or indeed sends a ballot to there are different ways to do it. I think it's safe to say that it's not that easy here in North Carolina. It could be easier. Whether we go as far as sending everyone a ballot or sending everyone a ballot request, there are steps, for instance, that the Board of Elections has already recommended in terms of making it possible for you to fax or email in a request. That could make it easier for people to get their vote by mail ballot. Those are the kinds of minimal things that we need to do.
Okay. There's some question about with our current absentee ballot system, they require 2 signatures. And part of that, I think, is because of the ballot harvesting
security, right?
So in a sense, are we removing something that was put in place to prevent fraud?
Maybe. I mean, Hazen, I thought Rick Hazen's article again in the Washington Post this week was pretty good. He says there are other steps that can be taken. You can put limits on how many ballots that any individual can bring in. I think that's what's done in Colorado. They limit them to 10. You can put up you can use other tactics to, and just more aggressive enforcement of the law and more aggressive review of who it is that's bringing ballots in to try to, prevent the kind of ballot harvesting we saw. I think the hope is that because we're sort of onto that now, it's not something that you could, everybody's going to be on the lookout for ballot harvesting throughout North Carolina. I think the hope is that even if we somehow liberalize the laws in terms of making it easier for people not to have to go to great lengths to get multiple signatures, that we could still have a very fair and honest election. If we do keep that requirement, I was talking to my neighbor the other day. He said, well, I'm ready to start organizing ballot signing parties for the neighborhood, come November. And maybe we'll see something like that. Maybe we'll literally have to go at it ourselves to come up with systems for people at the local level to guarantee that everybody on their street and everybody in their neighborhood has access to 2 signatures if we continue to have that requirement.
Okay. I'm scrolling back to look
Sure.
to see if I missed any questions here. Bonnie, is there anything that I overlooked? Let's see. Usually absentee ballots are not counted on election day unless it's a close race. What would happen with mail-in ballots?
That's another suggestion that's been made at the national level. Let's just treat them like other ballots. Let's count them all at the same time. I think if we're going to be moving in that direction, that's where we need to head. We need to head to a system in which mail-in ballots are treated like every other ballot. And again, the very idea of having a system so that when we count them, we actually have a means to flag the ballots maybe that have an error or something that a citizen could it might take a little while to get that all done, to get it finalized, but it seems to me it's worth it to guarantee the franchise to as many people as possible and to do it in as expeditious a way as possible. So I would argue in favor of them, yes, being treated like all other ballots.
What about concerns about social services to handle early release prisoners who need to be quarantined and so forth? What if their family doesn't want them to come back for fear of being infected?
Easily imaginable, right? I mean, and not everybody has a family to go to. We're going to need, yeah, you're going to need systems. You're going to need, just as we're now, trying to come up with making use of hotel rooms, for instance, to house people who are in particular high risk jobs where they're not in a position to go home every night. And subsidizing those. Those are the kinds of very practical solutions we're going to have to consider. Again, it's we're in uncharted waters here. This is very new stuff, and there's an initial, you can feel the initial reaction that people have saying, wait, what? What are we? These are prisoners. These are people who've been convicted of crime, and now we're going to put them up in a hotel with services. And I understand that initial instinct, but when you look at you think about it logically, you think about the data, you think about the science of not taking action, it becomes, the best of a series of not terribly, ideal solutions.
A few folks are worried about the implication of the post office's vulnerable state vis-a-vis mail-in ballots.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know we've gotten a lot of comments on our website on a lot of our stories from actual postal workers who are very concerned in general about the state of the Postal Service. We're going to be running a story at NC Policy Watch this week, probably tomorrow afternoon or Friday morning, from our Washington office, that's about the whole debate over whether the Postal Service is about to become extinct. I mean, there is obviously a fight in Washington over subsidies to the Postal Service and its viability as an institution, which is a pretty amazing thing to contemplate. Again, I would argue this comes back to that same old story. We've had systematic underinvestment in what ought to be a core public structure for so long that this system is in a position where the managers and the supervisors are in a tough spot, and they probably are cutting corners, and they're probably leaving line workers feeling vulnerable. We know there have been some postal workers who have tested positive. I'm not aware of a postal worker who's tested positive that they know that it in fact came from touching of an infected piece of mail, but it's something to be very concerned about. And the fact that we have overworked postal workers who sometimes are in proximity to each other that's too close is a concern. And the general issue of the Postal Service and what we're going to do with it is a big concern. But I think it's probably still a much, as we could have saw in Wisconsin last week, where we had this disastrous situation. I mean, it's certainly a better situation than trying to conduct a traditional election, if indeed we're in a situation where the virus is as widespread as it is right now.
Donna asks, usually absentee ballots are not counted on election day unless there's a close race.
Right.
What would happen with mail-in ballots?
Yeah, we were just talking about the fact that I think that would be one thing we would recommend. They need to be treated more like, I mean, I recognize there are challenges in terms of what the actual ballots look like and how they're processed through the computer, which is another issue we probably should be talking about in North Carolina, some way of making all of our ballots the same. But I think the reality is we need to be moving in the direction, as they do in other states, of having them counted like other ballots. I mean, somehow there are 5 states in our union that have nothing but mail-in ballots, and large parts of California as well, that's how they conduct elections. Oregon, Utah, Colorado, that's how they conduct elections. And they manage to get the results out on election night. So it obviously can be done.
With the reality that election day will be a mess if we have to vote in person, will there be any efforts to push for voting day to be a holiday or to add more early voting days?
I think that's the State Board of Elections has actually recommended making Election Day a holiday. I haven't sensed that there's been much of a favorable response from the Republican leadership of the General Assembly to that, but it's early. Yeah, I think there will be many people in the democracy community making a strong argument that we need to have as liberal, well-funded, expansive system of early voting as is possible, a system that allows voters to be spread out over a longer period of time, more access and more sites. We had this absurd situation in Wisconsin, though, where we had 180 precincts in Milwaukee and only 5 of them open on election day. We obviously can't have a situation like that. And if we are in a situation where the pandemic remains or has flared back up again, we're having a new wave of it, that raises real concerns of whether you could even attract enough poll workers to staff enough sites for a prolonged period of time. So there's a lot of balls in the air right now. But I mean, I think all those options need to be on the table.
What are the politics of the legislature's relationship with the North Carolina Board of Elections?
Well, as you all know, for a long time, the North Carolina General Assembly tried to remake the Board of Elections, and you might even say to remake it in its own image. And they've ultimately failed in that. So it's probably safe to say that it's not, there are suspicions there. Although the Board of Elections composition is exactly what it was now when Governor Pat McCrory was governor, and it's the same system that we had then. The Republican General Assembly has now decided that, we even had Senate President Pro Tem Phil Berger saying recently that he, didn't think that he couldn't trust Governor Cooper to run a fair election, which is a pretty amazing and outrageous slur. I think it's safe to say that it's not super close. And hopefully there's a lot of work that can be done. We have had the heartening development that really has been more of a bipartisan response at the General Assembly in recent weeks, at least in the House committees that have been meeting. I'm still, having some hope in my heart that that's a possibility for our approach to the election debates as well.
Do you think mail-in voting would help the GOP? Most absentee ballots are generally Republican.
The latest studies don't indicate that. The latest studies indicate that there's no I just saw one published last night by some Stanford University researchers that indicate that there's no particular partisan advantage from their study of how absentee balloting goes. That's why you've got some deeply blue states in the West that are implementing it, and we've got a red state like Utah that uses mail-in balloting as well. It doesn't seem, I know that there's sort of that intuitive thought that traditionally absentee ballots were used mostly by wealthy people who were out of town on vacation and had the money to do that, and therefore tended to be Republican. I think that's a trend that's changing, and I think it's moving in the direction that more people of all parties are kind of getting used to the idea that this is a legitimate way to have an election.
Do you think that there's any chance still that we would have photo ID required in November, and what impact would that have on what's going on?
I don't think there's any chance that's going to happen. I think it's a very happy development that that's not going to happen. The trials that will be taking place are going to go on for a long time. I think if it did happen, it would be a very negative development. That's of course been the great irony historically of the whole voter ID push by the folks on the right, is that it's not required for people who vote by mail, vote absentee. And for some reason that never seemed to worry them, that people voting absentee, I think it just goes to show that the whole voter ID thing was silly to begin with. It's unnecessary, it's a red herring, and hopefully it will remain at bay for a great length of time.
Okay. Lots of folks are thanking you for your observations and hoping you'll come back soon again to keep us informed and motivated and active, and are very appreciative of your expertise and your clarity. Thank you so much.
Oh, you all, man, it just warms my heart. I can't believe there's so many people doing this on a Wednesday night. Congratulations to you all. Keep up the good work. I feel, things are turning around in our country, and I really think like this event we're in the midst of now is going to be the catalyst for some really hopeful change in the months ahead. So keep the faith, everybody.
Rob, thank you so much for being here. And before we let you go and say goodbye to everybody else, I just want to point out to everyone that a lot of calls to action about the things that Rob has been talking about are summarized on our website that I just put in the chat. And there are 2 different ways that you can take action to advocate for prisoners. And there are various ways to submit public comment to the House Committee on COVID about elections and Medicaid expansion and protecting workers. So I do encourage everyone to go to the website. Those are, we're following leading organizations, ACLU, the NAACP, Democracy NC, Common Cause. I don't think one of these is NC Justice Center this week, but often, one of them is NC Justice Center also.
There.
So, right. So I really do encourage everyone to go there because that's one way that we can act on the kinds of things that Rob is telling us. And Rob, thank you so much for being here, for your tireless work, to your team's work. And thank you everyone for coming. We look forward to seeing you at our next event, which is going to be April 29th.
2 weeks.
So 2 weeks at 7:30.
Sharon, excuse me, back up. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I'm just showing people on our website how you can go click on the actions and events and actions underneath that, and it tells you what our current calls to action are, and they are all related to these topics, and they're good books. So please do that.
Thank you for showing that. So our next event is going to be April 29th at 7:30. It's in the works, so we can't quite tell you yet what it's going to be, but it's going to be good. And so please save the date and look for the announcement in our Monday email so that you can sign up for that. And thank you everybody for being here. Have a lovely evening.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks again, Rob.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Good night.
Night.
Bye.
Becca and
Hi, Carol.
Susan. I will share photos. I did
Oh, good.
screenshots like usual.
Oh, good. Share 'em.
I got several of you guys. So